Welcome back to my channel, Schizophrenia in My Family. I'm Kareem. The reasons for people developing schizophrenia are not well understood. In today's video, I'll discuss how I came up with the ideas and reasons that extreme sensitivity drives schizophrenia. I'll also talk about the current treatment methods and explain how medication works to reverse psychosis. So, let's dive into it. In order to explain how I came up with my ideas, I have to backtrack and discuss my light bulb moment. The idea came to me when I came across a medical journal where they discussed a curious and unexplained phenomenon. They have discovered that people who are born blind do not develop schizophrenia. This is called congenital blindness, meaning that they have never had any vision and so they have never been able to process vision. If we think about that, it means that no part of their brain has ever been configured or trained to process vision. For me, this is the start of the solution to the puzzle. To me, being an IT person, that means that they have a tremendous reserve processing capacity to assign to their other senses and for emotional processing. It also means that they don't have the risk to be overloaded with visual senses and the subsequent emotional processing of what they see. We already know that people who are blind have enhanced senses when compared to other people with vision. In computers, images and visual processing is one of the most expensive things from a processing or resource perspective. For people, we find that our brain has to allocate a lot of our brain power to visual processing. To me, this is the elusive but logical reason that they do not develop the illness. It also explains why when we as normal people are exposed to too much sensory input or are made to process too much information, which is stress, then we can develop mental illness. We see this in torture. Our brains become overloaded and begins to shut down and burn out in the same way a computer does when it overheats under too much load. Left in this condition for too long, people develop psychoses. Computers start to have thermal damage. The main difference here is that for computers, thermal damage is more or less permanent, but our brains have a limited capacity to heal being biologically based. Our brains can also recover due to neuroplasticity if the load is reduced. Think of this as using the extra remaining good functioning parts of our brain to recover some of that lost function. Congenitally blind people have a vast amount of this extra capacity. I think that this damage is caused by hypersensitivity, which is overactive sensation or overactive nerve and brain cell functioning. If this is correct, then I would expect to see some sort of damage in the nerve cells and their transmission methods, as described in this article. Damage to myelin is commonly associated with mental illnesses like schizophrenia. Antipsychotic medication blocks some of the neurotransmitters to reduce that sensitivity in the brain. This is similar to painkillers, which reduce sensitivity in the nerves. Once this happens, the brain starts to heal or recover, and psychosis recedes. It also goes to show why when people go off the medication, since they feel they are not sick, then the psychosis returns. The medication makes them feel better, and then they don't want to continue taking it, since the side effects are significant. However, they still have the underlying sensitivity, and once they put themselves back into a position where they're stressed, usually school or work stress, then the psychosis creeps back into their lives. It is a cycle that my sister has repeated time and time again, and is very typical of people with schizophrenia. Currently, she's on an injectable medication every 2 weeks or up to 4 weeks if she delays to go in, and she has not had a relapse for years. And yes, she desperately wants to stop the medication. The dark side of this, however, is that this cycle of relapse back into psychosis means that they have increasing cumulative damage to the brain, and each subsequent level of recovery is less. I have seen this as her functioning level after each psychotic episode has been lower and lower. Many years ago, I was told that antipsychotic medication takes up to 6 weeks to reach full strength in the blood. That, the doctor explained, is why it also takes so long to change medications, to find the right one with the least severity of side effects. This belief of delayed onset action of medication used to be a staple statement in many medical psychology textbooks. This didn't make too much sense to me, and upon further research, I found that recently it has been debunked. Apparently, the medication takes effect in as little as 2 hours to reduce the neurotransmitter activity in the brain. It takes between 2 to 6 weeks for the healing effect to present itself in the patient, which makes a lot more sense to me, with most healing occurring in the first 2 weeks. It's like before, they would say that when you break a bone, it takes 6 weeks for the cast to work. Now, it's more accurate to say the healing starts right away, but it takes 6 weeks for the bones to knit together. This idea of sensitivity extracting an additional cost to us is best explained by something I just recently became aware of in myself. A few months ago, I learned about highly sensitive people, or HSP. I also realized that not only am I an HSP, I'm pretty extreme on the spectrum. I took the self test, which I rated at 24 out of 27, which means I have extreme sensitivity. Being an HSP has been discovered to be a genetic trait. Again, back to the genes. It is a trait shared by over 100 different species. An HSP sees and extracts more information from their senses and by extension their environment. They have a higher sensory and processing load. Think of it like in a herd of animals, the HSP animals see and sense the predators first. They are the canaries in the coal mine. About 15 to 20% of the population has this genetic trait of high sensory and processing sensitivity. Or, for a more funny illustration, think about a group of fruit flies. When fruit is presented, the 80% of the flies normally dive right in and feast. The 20% of HSP fruit flies hangs back to gather more data about the situation before acting. And then the 80% get hit by the fly swatter.
The research on animals, these are just 3 distinct studies that give us a really good idea. And so the fruit flies, sitters versus rovers. So in the presence of food, some fruit flies will sit, and some are zipping all over the place. So it turns out, this is kind of crazy and hard to believe, but I promise it's true. The sitters have more neural complexity than the rovers. They're thinking before they go zipping to the food. The pumpkin seed sunfish, they're in a pond studied by biologists at Cornell, and they identified 2 different categories of these fish, bold and timid. And it turns out that the bold ones were the ones who were less responsive to novel things. So if there's a trap in the pond that wasn't there before, 80 to 85% of the pumpkin seed sunfish just swam right into the trap and got trapped. And 15 to 20% said, there's something new. Let me hesitate and stay back from the trap.
For people who are HSPs, they have more sensitive senses, and so they have more input that the brain needs to process. HSPs also process information more deeply and make more connections where other people do not. HSPs also tend to feel and experience things more deeply and have to do more emotional processing. Some famous examples of people who are HSPs are Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., Albert Einstein, Steve Martin, Princess Diana, Jane Goodall, and Emily Dickinson. That explains a lot for me. This is why I think highly sensitive people are more at risk to develop the illness. Highly sensitive people are also more empathetic in general. When exposed to difficult events, HSPs are more easily affected, and those events can more easily become emotional trauma. If you have read the biography of Abraham Lincoln, then you know he fought with depression for his entire adult life. You only have to listen to Martin Luther King Jr. to understand how empathetic, caring, and sensitive he was. If you listen to Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, you would see the incredible insights and observations that he made. A person who is less sensitive will perceive the same events differently or not as strongly, and has a better chance to not be as affected by them. Sensitive people are aware of when things around them are getting busy and when their senses are taxed. In very busy environments, I feel the sensory overload almost immediately and know when I've had enough and need to rest and retreat. It's time to leave the party. I also have all of the characteristics and traits of what we would call an empath or someone who is very empathetic. I think that my sister also gets overloaded by everything around her, and her emotions lead her into illness. I think that is why she is even further along the spectrum than I am. One amazing story that happened that illustrates her extreme sensitivity as compared to me was when we were both teenagers. I was around 17 years old and she was about 19 or 20, and I think that she was in the initial phase of the illness. At the time, I didn't know, but our family physician had already prescribed my sister some stelazine to stabilize her, but my mom didn't know why or that she was even ill. Stelazine was the same antipsychotic that my aunt had been prescribed, so maybe my father was aware at the time. We had taken a family trip from Thunder Bay to Toronto for my mom to attend a professional function at the University of Guelph. My mom was an English professor at Lakehead University. We were staying in the Yorkdale Inn at Lawrence and Dufferin. It was a seedy hotel with a strip club attached, but it is no longer there. My mom had gone to Guelph to attend the event and left my dad, my sister, and me alone at our hotel. My sister was hard to bear due to the illness, and that night my dad couldn't handle it. So, being a typical Guyanese Caribbean man that evening, he went to the bar to get a drink or two. So, my sister and I were alone in the hotel room, and it was dark out. Then suddenly we heard the screech of tires and the crash of a car accident. My sister, for no explainable reason, screamed out loud, "Dad!" I thought, no, can't be. Oh, shit. She might be right. So I grabbed my sister, who was a nervous mess, and my room and car keys and headed downstairs. We went to the road, and sure enough, there was a crowd gathered around the accident scene. We made our way through the crowd of people, and there was a police officer who told us to stay back. I looked past him, and sure enough, there was Dad on the ground in front of the car with blood on his forehead from where his head impacted the car windscreen. That was a moment of great stress for me, and the cortisol burned into my memory the image of him lying on the road with glass and blood on his forehead. How did my sister know? Maybe she picked up the sound of his voice from our room when he was hit by the car? I really have no other explanation. For her, she seems to pick up on these things but can't control it. But for me, I have to relax to let it in more. I think I've developed this as a protective measure so I don't get so overwhelmed like she does. The next unanswered question is, why does schizophrenia develop during adolescence? To answer this, we need to think about what it means to be a child versus an adult and why it would make sense for this illness to usually start when people go through puberty, and especially when people enter university and are under a great deal of stress. From my IT perspective, a child is a great general processor of information. They can handle vast volumes of sensory input and then process it and store it. They are learning all the time. At the same time, we generally treat our children the best, which means that they are not yet exposed to stresses in life like work, drugs, or poor diet. As a result of this health and mass general processing ability, they can successfully handle all of that input. It doesn't mean that they don't have trauma or sensitivity. It just means that they still have that massive brain power to handle it all. The limitation the children have is that they never become quite as good at specific skills as an adult. Then, as we enter puberty, we are flooded with hormones and emotions that are new to us. At the same time, our brains start to specialize to become better at specific functions and less good at others that aren't so important to us. For example, as adults, we need to be able to attract a mate and reproduce, and also to become very good at our chosen jobs and skills. So, we gain a deeper skill set at the expense of the ability to process the massive amounts of data that children are so good at. We literally become specialized processors, but a little bit dumber overall. In my family, for example, we play the Japanese game of kendama, which requires really good hand-eye coordination. I'm really good at it, and my teen Ethan is also becoming very good at it. Mava, who is 7, and Logan, who is now 11, are not nearly as good, but they can still do it maybe 2 or 3 moves. Ethan and we can do maybe 15 or 20 moves in a row. So I did some research to see if what I was thinking was something that was also observed scientifically. These are now quotes from the medical community describing what is going on. Throughout childhood and adolescence, synaptic pruning occurs during which unused connections are removed in order to maximize efficiency. This process of transformation can have unexpected results. Synaptic pruning is an essential part of brain development. By getting rid of the synapses that are no longer used, the brain becomes more efficient as you age. Today, most ideas about human brain development draw on this idea of brain plasticity. Synaptic pruning involves the elimination of excess neurons in synapses. That is, those that have not established a connection with a neighboring cell will die. C4 tags a synapse for pruning by depositing it with a sister protein in it called C3. Again, the more C4 that gets switched on, the more synapses got eliminated. For example, adolescents have been shown to experience a brief decline in facial recognition ability during puberty, which coincides with the end stages of synaptic pruning. Many genes play a role in your odds of getting schizophrenia. A change to any of them can do it. But usually, it's several small changes that add up to and leads to a higher risk. Doctors aren't sure how genetic changes lead to schizophrenia, but they found that people who may have the disorder may be more likely to have problems in their genes that may interfere with brain development. Quote, that's the end of the quotes. And it's really quite vague, but we're thinking the same thing. Next, I wanted more detail on how this neuropruning occurs, and this led me to a research article. In addition, they also made note that this pruning is the strongest genetic link as a predictor for people to develop schizophrenia. Again, I don't think that's a coincidence. They have found that there is a C4 gene, which is largely responsible for synaptic pruning, and it is again inherited. I can also imagine that if we consider that our senses are partly a learned or trained skill in our brains, then that sensitivity may also be further enhanced during puberty. So we experience the world in even more sensitive and emotional ways, taking us back to sensitivity. I often observe in my son Ethan, who is 16, that he has a much greater emotion than he did as a child. I mean, we kind of have the term angry or sensitive teen for a reason, right? We usually just attribute this to the teenage years and leave it at that. What may be going on is that their hormones are making them more sensitive in general so that they can function as adults and better perceive things like threats or to be better at these new adult tasks. So, in summary, the medical community feels that genes play a role, but other than the genes for neural synapse pruning, they aren't sure how they contribute. My thinking is that our genes make us more or less sensitive, and based on the pruning gene, which goes into high gear during puberty, the gene makes us a bit more efficient at specialization, which also enhances our physical and emotional sensitivity. In people with schizophrenia, this pruning is overdone. This genetic predisposition for higher sensitivity places a greater load on our brains, and if the load is too high, then stress, pain, trauma, and illness follow progressively. The scientific community believes that in people with schizophrenia, the pruning may be too aggressive, or I would describe it as making people too sensitive or too specialized. Circling back to my light bulb moment, then why would congenital blindness prevent schizophrenia? My thinking is that with all of that reserve brain matter, which is essentially processing and storage power, people born blind have sufficient reserve capacity to handle all of the remaining 4 senses since they never have to deal with vision. This means that they are much less likely to end up in a position of stress overload from having to process all 5 senses. This is, in addition to the resulting emotions, processing, and storage of memories that has to occur from our senses. It also means that likely their remaining 4 senses will be sharper since they can use some of that reserve power to process them. And that is what we find. They have reserve brain power to process and store their experiences via the 4 senses, and also have enough capacity to efficiently process their emotions. Now that I've discussed my reasoning for sensory overload being the primary cause, we can talk about what I think is the likely required course of action for the cure. The primary cure for now is medication. I know that that isn't what people want to hear, but once you enter the state of psychosis, medication remains the best and easiest method of intervention. The next best way is then prevention, since if you don't overload or you can recognize when the overload is occurring and can step back, then you can prevent the illness. You may be able to prevent the more damaging effects to your brain. This is why healthy living and trauma avoidance is so important, especially for people at high risk. Unfortunately, the trauma avoidance may be beyond our control. This is also why it is so important to identify if your child is an HSP or not. Schizophrenia is a complex illness with many factors seeming to be required to cause the illness. As a result of this, I think it will also require multiple solutions. I see schizophrenia as an illness with a treatment in a similar fashion to, say, high blood pressure or like AIDS. We know that genetic predisposition and lifestyle choices play a role in most illnesses like high blood pressure. For example, with high blood pressure, you can have a family history which makes you more likely to have it. You can also manage it with diet and exercise to a great degree. Cut out salt and alcohol and eat healthy foods. Lastly, your doctor will ask you to reduce your stress and exercise to help with blood pressure. If all of that doesn't work, then you may need blood pressure medication, but that should be the last resort. With schizophrenia, medication is the first resort to eliminate the psychoses. We also know or assume that schizophrenia is a multi-factor illness, meaning that it is complicated, and there is likely no single cause or solution as a result. For an analogy here, I like to think of the cure for AIDS. First, there was no treatment, and then they started to develop antiviral medications to keep people alive. This is very similar to antipsychotics that bring people back from psychoses. The breakthrough in AIDS treatment came when they developed multiple complementary treatments that they combined into a cocktail. With this new approach, which attacked the virus in multiple different ways, they could virtually eliminate the AIDS virus from the blood and bodies of patients, resulting in an effective cure. I think that schizophrenia will be such an illness requiring multiple health and lifestyle choices to bring it under control, and then having medication as more of a complementary and last resort option rather than our only option. This will, to a great degree, depend on how well the person can adhere to the voluntary and lifestyle choices and how serious the cumulative traumas that were experienced were. I'm not sure, and we may not get there, but we can have hope. Until then, medication continues to be the first and most successful method to fight the illness and prevent psychosis. In future, we may need to have healthcare professionals like case managers who can assist people battling schizophrenia daily in doing things like following a healthy exercise regimen, healthy diet, as well as other things to ensure they maintain their mental well-being. In effect, what I'm saying is that we already likely have the right tools to manage the illness, but most people don't have the required discipline to live such a healthy lifestyle. And so it would be even more challenging for someone with mental illness. I see this with my sister. She has difficulty with a healthy diet, exercise, she has no regular friends or activities, she doesn't work, and she would frequently not take her antidepressant and antipsychotic medication. This is why antipsychotic medication is usually the first and most effective way to keep people out of psychosis once a person develops psychosis. Thank you for watching, and I hope this helps explain why and how I developed the theory of hypersensitivity leading to mental illness. Maybe if we can identify this hypersensitivity, then we can start to see who would be more at risk and which families are more at risk. Today, for example, we test the hearing of babies and people, but we don't test if they are highly sensitive or HSP. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I would also appreciate if you can like and subscribe to my channel to encourage me to make more videos like this. And also let me know if you think that my theory is making more sense. In my next video, I'll discuss what happens to me to develop these ideas and why it is a combination of diet and stress with potentially far-reaching implications well beyond mental health care.